ideas on people that you'd like to hear to or topics you'd like to hear, obviously get those to us and we'll reach out and try to recruit as many great speakers as possible. Obviously this is about creating great debates, great civil discourse, and having a conversation, as you saw from some of the past ones if you've attended. Just a great conversation. What we'll do is I'll introduce our speakers today, then we'll allow them to give and take back and forth, then we'll open up for questions after that. So with that, I want to introduce our two speakers. I also want to say before we get started, this, this event, sandwiches, all those types of things, fees, whatever it might be that we've paid in the past, has been through local supporters. So I just want to say for all of you guys, just know that there's people out there that are making this possible, and we just want to thank them from the bottom of our heart. With that, we're honored to have with us, if you've seen the bios, Dr. Stanley Fish. Dr. Stanley Fish has more than 60 years of scholarship before he came here to New College. He is currently a presidential scholar in residence. His incredible career includes stops at Duke, Johns Hopkins, Cal Berkeley. There's even a library dedicated archive of his work at the University of California, Irvine. Dr. Fish has also been chosen by the Chicago Tribune as the Chicagoan of the Year for Culture in 2003. There have been, I want to say, 200 articles, books, parts of books, dissertations, reviews, articles devoted to his work. He's here teaching courses on Milton and on how to write a sentence, which was one of his books. We're honored to have Dr. Fish and his just absolutely, I always joke, being a sports guy, that Dr. Fish is our LeBron James in residence. He's a LeBron James of academia. And if you're a Michael Jordan fan, I'll say Michael Jordan, but I'm a LeBron guy. With that, we're also honored to have with us one of our trustees. As you guys know, when the new trustees got chosen, 3 of our trustees are very, very accomplished academics. One of them is here tonight to facilitate the interview with Dr. Fish, is Mark Bauerlein. Mark is a professor emeritus of English at Emory University, and he's the editor of First Things magazine. In 2003, 2005, he served as a director of the Office of Research and Analysis at the National Endowment for the Arts. He's the author or editor of 11 books, including Something Phobia. I'll butcher it. Negrophobia. Is that right? Negrophobia, sorry. He has, his essays have appeared in the Yale Review, Partisan Review, Wilson Quarterly, PMLA, and Philosophy and Literature. Apart from his scholarly work, Dr. Bauerlein publishes in popular periodicals such as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Weekly Standard, the Washington Post, TLS, the Chronicle for Higher Education, etc. He has been interviewed on numerous media outlets more than 500 times, including spots on CNN, Fox, NPR, BBC, World Today, CBS News, and Nightline, PBS, Frontline, 2020. Dr. Bauerlein got his degree, and doctorate in English and master's in English from UCLA. So with that, I would ask our 2 esteemed gentlemen to come up, and we'll begin the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to speak.
Stanley will start at the podium with a 20-minute opening, and then we'll have some conversation, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Thank you. Let me begin by, Let me begin by thanking you all for coming here this early evening. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you, and it's a pleasure for me to have been a part of this campus community since the middle of January. And I'm grateful to President Corcoran and to other members of his administration for inviting me to join you. And I'm grateful to those members of the staff and of the administration at New College for arranging and implementing this event. Thank you very much. What I'm going to say this evening for about 20 minutes or so, will be general in the sense that I'm going to lay down some definitional markers, attempting to pin down some of these terms that are so often heard in the course of debates. I won't be saying much about particular issues or particular events that you might have in mind, and therefore I'm inviting you to question me after Mark and I have had a conversation. It may be that you would like to know what he and I think about something or other that has happened, or perhaps about a hypothetical that you might be able to frame. What if, et cetera, what should then happen at a college or university? But meanwhile, the remarks will be somewhat general. I'm here to talk about academic freedom, freedom of speech, the relationship between the two. Is this microphone reaching everyone, by the way? Okay. The relationship between the two, and the relationship of the two to the question of political expression on colleges and college and university campuses. This, as you all know, is a complicated matter. It has generated claims, counterclaims, accusations, and a number of laws in various states, a few of which I may be referencing today. But before any reasonable conversation about these matters can begin, we must have some definitions. I will offer you mine in the knowledge that you may not agree with them. And you can, of course, register your disagreement, and I hope you will, in the question and answer period. But if my definitions are at least on the table, you will be able to follow the chain of reasoning that issues from them. Let's start with academic freedom. In many ways, an odd, and I would say peculiar doctrine. Many who invoke it hear only the word freedom and forget the limiting adjective academic. It's academic freedom. What the limiting adjective academic tells you, or should tell you, is that what we are interested in is not some large and sacred value, freedom in capital letters about 8 feet tall. That's not, or should not be, the focus, but rather we're interested in the nature of a freedom, or latitude, that belongs particularly to academic labor. We're interested in the kind of work we are expected to do by virtue of being academics, because only if we know that can we then ask the question, what degree of freedom makes sense for those who are attempting to do that work? So, academic freedom, and here is my definition, and as usual it's fairly minimalist. Academic freedom is the freedom or latitude necessary to the performance of the academic task. That's it. Academic freedom is the freedom or latitude necessary to the performance of the academic task. A moment ago I used the word peculiar to describe. Oh, okay, sorry. Thank you very much. A moment ago I used the word peculiar to describe academic freedom. But what is truly peculiar is the kind of work that requires for its accomplishment a degree of latitude not required in other areas. We don't hear anything about dentist freedom, or accountant freedom, or dermatologist freedom, or car salesman freedom. And the reason that these phrases seem bizarre is that workers in those and many other areas are understood to be following pre-formulated protocols, rules, and routines on the way to achieving an end or goal, the fixing of a tooth or the sale of a car, that is agreed on in advance by both the deliverer of the service and those who receive the service. These activities are not completely scripted, but are largely scripted, whereas academic work is decidedly non-scripted. You don't know when you begin it where it's going to go, and you don't even know that it's going to go anywhere. It's a very unusual industry where you can work for years on a product that you then fail to deliver and say to your superiors in an organization, well, I thought that would pan out 15 years ago, but it hasn't. And as a result, you get a raise in salary. This is very odd. You have to, this is extremely odd. Okay, now the phrase that best captures this key feature of academic freedom is freedom of inquiry. Freedom of inquiry has nothing to do with the academic practitioner. It is not something that you or I can claim. It has everything to do with the practice of which we are members. If you call yourself an academic, this is the way you must proceed. Not because of any moral right you have. I am very suspicious in all areas of anybody claiming any moral rights whatsoever. Not because of any moral rights you have, but because of professional obligation that has you. If you're an academic beginning a project, you don't decide in advance the truth of a disputed matter, and neither do you decide in advance that some path possibly leading to the truth must not be gone down. As we say, you follow the evidence where it leads, and it is the career of evidence, unfolding often in unanticipated ways, that is free. Not you. You're not free. Properly understood, then, academic freedom is a constraint. Academic freedom is a constraint. It tells you what you have to do in order to be an academic in good standing. You have to allow your conclusions to be forced upon you by the evidence rather than chosen by you on the basis of your preferences, allegiance, commitments, or beliefs. This is what I meant when I defined academic freedom as the freedom appropriate to the academic task. It is freedom from any constraints external to the evidentiary process, constraints suggested or imposed by politicians, legislatures, donors, and parents. And it is also the freedom for, and indeed the obligation to, resist when someone tells you that you must not say this, or you must say that, or that this topic is one you must take up, while that topic is one you are forbidden to take up. Anyone who says any of these things is immediately to be distrusted. Academic freedom is a very limited freedom. It frees you from the external pressures exercised by alien constituencies and binds you to the unpredictable and often wandering paths evidence takes on its way to a conclusion which in some cases may never be reached. In a way, then, you are not free at all, and you are especially not free to substitute for the ideological perspectives you rightly push away when they are urged on you by others, the ideological perspectives you yourself prefer. You can't say no to the politics others would impose on you and then say yes to the politics you find congenial. It doesn't matter whether the political views you let into the course of inquiry belong to someone else or belong to you. They simply shouldn't be there. You have to run a clean shop as an academic, where inquiry is guided by its own emergent imperatives and not by imperatives imported from elsewhere, even when that elsewhere is you. The idea and the ideal is to teach so that at the end of the semester, none of your students has the slightest idea of your views on any subject except the subject of the assigned material. Therefore, and these are just examples, no teaching for social justice. Social justice is a fine thing, no doubt, but it is not an academic fine thing. No teaching democracy as the best of all political systems. You can, of course, teach and subject to interrogation democracy's claims to be the best of political systems, but you can't teach democracy as the best political system. No presentation of critical race theory as the gospel, and no rejection of critical race theory as dangerous and un-American. No bashing of dead white males, but no worship of dead white males. Now, every teacher has more views on just about anything than you can shake a stick at. But keep those views, however noble, inspiring, and incisive you believe them to be, to yourself. But couldn't your views come in through the back door of the First Amendment? Couldn't your constitutionally given right of free speech be invoked to authorize the expressions of opinions in the classroom and elsewhere on the campus? The answer is no, and for several reasons. And the first, and to my mind dispositive reason, is that the doctrine of free speech has no place in the setting of the academy. The doctrine of free speech has no place in the setting of the academy. Or to put it in another way, free speech is not an academic value. I want you to think about that one. It's kind of the key. Free speech is not an academic value. It is a political value that mandates universal participation in the discussion of matters of public concern. Freedom of speech is an offshoot of the even broader doctrine of equality. We are equal before the law, and therefore each of us has an equal right to the podium and to participation in the making of the law. No voice should be uniquely preferred. No voice should be excluded. The hallmark of democracy with respect to freedom of speech is the more voices, the better. That's not the hallmark of the academy, where much of the institutional machinery is devoted to determining which voices will be silenced. Hiring committees, tenure and promotion committees, dean's committees, provost committees, the publishers of learned journals, all of these are engaged in the business of saying to various candidates and would-be authors, no, you're not going to be heard. In the academy, the ratio of those who gain the podium in relationship to those who seek it is very small. Many more are sent away than are invited in. Why? Because if the determination of the truth is the goal of academic activity, as it surely is, you don't want those who participate in it, both on the teaching end and the research end, to be anything but credentialed and tested and vetted. Again, I'll say that again. If the determination of truth is the goal of academic activity, you want those who participate in it, both on the teaching end and on the research end, to be credentialed, tested, and vetted. You want participants who know what they are talking about, and not participants who just want to talk. That, I hardly need say, is not democracy. It is more like Darwinism, where the winnowing out of aspirants leaves many by the wayside and confers legitimacy and a platform only on a select few. So there's the argument pretty much. Academic freedom is the freedom necessary to do the academic job. The academic job is the pursuit of truth in the humanities, social sciences, physical sciences, and computer sciences. That pursuit, known as free inquiry, requires that there be no impediments to its unpredictable course. That course must be allowed to flow freely, without either canonization or damnation in advance. And scholars and teachers are to go with that flow, independently of what any external constituency might say. Therefore, scholars and teachers are not free in any other sense. They are bound to their duties as set down in university regulations, and what they say must be in the service of academic inquiry and nothing else. The perhaps surprising result of this set of interlocking definitions, as I have offered them, is that there are few, if any, free speech issues on campus. All this stuff about free speech issues on campus is a bunch of bull. There are no free speech issues on campus, for reasons that I'm about to explain. Because the imperative to be followed is free inquiry and not free speech. Another way I put this is, and I'm trying to tell administrators this over and over again, you're not in the free speech business. You're in the education business. So stop responding to all of these anxious people who tell you that you are violating someone's free speech. Has nothing to do with what goes on in the academy. Because the imperative to be followed is free inquiry and not free speech, faculty members have no free speech rights at all, in general. They may have free speech rights in department meetings, but that's because department meetings are by and large Hyde Park settings, that is, lots of noise and little sense, either made or required. In the classroom, faculty members are free only to present the material as specified by the syllabus and department directives. Students are free to respond to the instructor's prompting, and that's it. Students have no independent freedom to challenge or to contribute to the curriculum, and administrators, well, they're the least free of all, bound as they are by the responsibilities of their office, the regulations that strictly define those responsibilities. Nor are colleges and universities as entities free in any significant sense. And they are certainly not free to speak their corporate minds. If recent events in Washington, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Philadelphia have taught us anything, it is that colleges and universities get into trouble when they pronounce on public matters, political and otherwise. And they should get into trouble, because as educational institutions, they have no credentials for dispensing general wisdom, political or otherwise. I know this is something that many PhD recipients find hard to accept, but your PhD guarantees your knowledge and perhaps a little wisdom on a specific topic, the one you were trained in and the one you're now trained and paid to teach. It doesn't guarantee you wisdom on anything else, therefore you should keep your mouth shut on most occasions. Colleges and universities in general do have credentials for pronouncing on matters related to the health and prosperity of higher education. On any other matter, they should remain silent. So in general, no free speech rights in the academy. Not for students, not for faculty, not for administrators, not for colleges and universities. The only right we have is the right to do our job, and to do it freely, that is, without external influence or compulsion. Any other freedom we claim is in excess of both our obligations and our capacities. Does this mean that political topics are banned from the classroom? Not at all. What is banned from the classroom is not the consideration of political topics, but the consideration of political topics from a political rather than a pedagogical perspective. Any topic is suitable for classroom discussion so long as it is held at arm's length and examined as an object to be analyzed or explained. That is what we as academics do or should do. Introduce issues not for the purpose of embracing or rejecting them, Because the moment we do that, introduce issues for the purpose of embracing or rejecting them or nudging our students in one direction or another, the moment we do that, we have become political agents rather than describers of political phenomenon. Let's take, for an example, something I mentioned a moment ago, critical race theory. The questions to be asked of critical race theory are the questions to be asked of any candidate for classroom inclusion. And they include, is this a significant phenomenon? Does it touch on recognizably important issues? Is it central to an ongoing conversation? Has it generated important and debated text? Does it have a vocabulary that has made its way into the national dialogue? The answers to those questions with respect to critical race theories are yes, 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 and yes. Therefore, critical race theory is worthy of study, not worthy of belief or adherence or allegiance, something you might do in relation to it outside the classroom, worthy of study. And I would say the same thing of topics like same-sex marriage, Holocaust denial, transgender studies, intelligent design, alt-right politics, Christian nationalism, Middle East disputes, Antifa, the Proud Boys, astrology, and yes, God help us, pronouns. All of these and many more that might have occurred to you are significant because they occupy cultural space and give rise to debates. They are not significant, at least for academic purposes, because they are either true or false, good or evil, patriotic or treasonous. These judgments are appropriately made in any number of venues, elections, church pulpits, parent-child discussions, but the only judgment appropriate to the academy is worthy of being studied or not worthy of being studied. So, study anything, so long as you can make a case for its responsiveness to academic interrogation. It's long been a practice to fix on something apparently minor and inconsequential. Movie posters, game shows, comic books, song lyrics, potholes, and make a persuasive argument for taking it seriously. That's how the scope of academic analysis is enlarged, by turning its lens on a hitherto unworthy subject and transforming it into something worthy. That is something, again, worthy of study. So that's what we do, study things. And we also study the studiers who have come before us. We are actively engaged in a conversation with a history, and we once continue that history and alter it, taking our place in the army of researchers who are drawn to the task of explaining what things are and how they work. That task, explaining what things are and how they work, is a difficult one, and we needn't and shouldn't add to it the task of moral and political justification, tasks performed appropriately by others and tasks we perform badly when we make the mistake of taking them up. So in the end, I leave you with this three-part mantra. And I have offered this mantra to the world before, some years ago, without, as far as I can tell, very much effect. But here it is, nevertheless. 1, do your job. 2, don't try to do somebody else's job. 3, don't let anyone else do your job. If I might alter the words of Polonius in Hamlet, if you are true to these precepts, you will at the same time be true to yourself and true to your colleagues and to your students, and you will be true to truth. Thank you.
All right.
I don't know, is this on? Yes, I guess it is. Right.
Yeah. So we'll talk for a few minutes. I'll ask a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up. It is an honor to be up here with Professor Fish. When I was in graduate school in the 80s, there were maybe a half a dozen major literary theorists in America. Not Europeans as well, but in America, and you know, along with Paul DeMond and Edward Said, Stanley Fish, the name. So it means a lot to share a stage with him. And on the biographical issue, I think, Stanley, you've told a story once when you were at Berkeley in the 1960s. And Berkeley was the center of campus political unrest, the student movements, the free speech movement, and then the anti-war movement. There was a lot of pressure on professors to, every once in a while, cancel classes. So students could go join a march, be part of a demonstration, whatever. That pressure was put on you. How did you respond to that at the time?
Well, our department had 115 people in it, which is an indication of the glory days of the state support of educational institutions. Of those 115, only 2 of us didn't either cancel our classes or alter our classes so as to make them seminars on the events that had been precipitated by the free speech movement. And I was teaching my course, which is in late 15th century literature, and I was teaching texts that were not even available except in pirated German editions. I used to tell my students the advantage of taking this course is you're going to be able to one-up anyone at a literary cocktail party. And so in the middle of my discussion, I think of the humpback line, a kind of metrical pattern, in the work of Thomas Occleve, whom I'm sure all of you have read. A student stood up and said to me, how can you be talking about Occleve and metrics while some of your students are being dragged down the steps of Sproul Hall, which was the main administration building? And I said, I don't need you or anyone else to nominate to me what my responsibilities are. My responsibilities are contractual. I'm now here doing what I was trained and paid to do. That would have been something like in 1964 or early 1965. So this can either be a boast or a self-accusation. I haven't changed my mind a bit.
And you were an assistant professor.
I was.
So you weren't safe.
I always thought I was. My teaching method, as some of my students who are here might be able to confirm. First, and I don't advise this on anyone, it's to some extent a function of personality. The first thing I do when I'm in a class is scare them to death. And then, little by little, I reveal myself as reasonably human. And they're so grateful for that that I've won the day.
All right. You talk about bringing controversial issues into the classroom and treating them not in a political way, but in a pedagogical way,
right,
as you say it. Is that a very hard line to observe, especially when a lot of the students in the class may have very strong feelings about those things? How do you keep it from, how do you hold the pedagogical?
Well, let me say, get myself into even more trouble. I'm sure my students have feelings, but I trust them to keep them to themselves. I don't want to know anything about my students' feelings, except their feelings about the material, which can vary. They can be distressed by it or puzzled by it or, in fact, dislike it and tell me why. So in my classes, at least, it's quickly made apparent that I'm not going to be interested in going down a path of inquiry which is not mandated by the material signed. Now, as far as the trick, if it is a trick of turning contentious political issues into objects of academic attention, something that I once called academicization, a really ugly word. It's just something that's easy to do. And I gave the example once, there was during George W. Bush's presidency, for which, by the way, some Democrats now long, look at the way the world has turned. During George W. Bush's presidency, there was a popular article asking the question, is George W. Bush the worst president in the history of the United States? Does this sound familiar and current, actually? And I turned that into an academic thing. I said, okay, what we have here is an American phenomenon, which is spreading to Europe, as many American phenomena do, of ranking. We rank everything. We rank wristwatches, we rank athletic teams, automobiles, restaurants, and so forth, and so we rank presidents. And I want to say, well, what is there about the American psyche that welcomes ranking, is drawn to ranking? Has it something to do with the supposedly classless nature of American society? Once you start to go down that road, take a look at the question, was George W. Bush, or is George W. Bush the worst president in American history? And you move away from the question as one that is viscerally asked, and then you take an academic look at the question. After about 25 minutes, it's an academic question. It's an academic question. The political urgency has been taken away from it and replaced by an academic urgency.
Okay. You talk about the academic task. And I imagine a lot of people would say that that itself is a rather idealized understanding of what we're doing in higher education. That if you want to sort of hold it up, entertain ideas without having any political valences involved in that, that itself is a false idealization, that the academic task is political through and through. The politics have become hidden, sedimented, implicit through the simple routines over the years. It just becomes the natural way of doing things, and that people who want to expand the definition of the academic task into more explicit political aims are saying, we're just being more honest about it.
Right.
What is your response to that?
That's a powerful argument that one does here. First of all, the word idealization is often accompanied by someone saying, well, you're just still pursuing the impossible dream of the ivory tower, which supposedly has been discredited. Well, I am here the champion of the ivory tower. What it means is that there is a kind of activity, let's call it college or university activity, whereas the great political theorist Michael Oakeshott said in the middle of the 20th century, certain urgencies, getting a job, electing a mayor, raising a family, are for a period suspended, or at least not put into the center, and instead, these are Oakeshott's words, you enjoy an interval. That was his word, I really like it. An interval where you turn things over. You look at this, you look at that, you look at it from this perspective, from that perspective, and then you bring something else in and expand the comparative focus. So that's an activity. I'm not saying that it's the best activity, although Aristotle did think that, as he said in the 10th book of his Ethics. I'm just saying that it's a distinctive activity. If academic work is merely an extension of political work, why not dispense with all of the machinery of academia? Let's not have classrooms. Let's not have laboratories. Let's not have libraries. Let's just have political discussions. All I'm saying is that academic work, academic activity, is a distinctive thing. I am also not saying that everyone has to engage in it. I am certainly not saying that those who don't engage in it are for that reason inferior people. I would never say that. I'm just saying, here it is. Here it is, this odd kind of thing where you look at material not with a view toward reaching a conclusion that will send you out of the class with marching orders. You look at the material with a view to looking again at the material, and then to looking again at the material, and that's it. Now, you can think that that's frivolous, and there are certain perspectives from which that's certainly a sound judgment, but nevertheless, that is what we do. If we start to do other things, we've entirely lost the center of our project.
The interval that you speak about, where you sort of suspend things for a moment, you hold an idea up and you entertain. You entertain it, you examine it, you go through the labor of understanding before taking a position for or against it or people, holding one opinion or another. That's not a natural inclination.
No.
Is a humanistic education in part designed to give people the capacity to hold off on the judgment a little bit, step back, come into the ivory tower? All your impulses can run against that.
You're tempting me, Mark.
Well,
you're tempting me to have a positive position, which I something that I I don't know. In other words, people are saying, what good is higher education? I'll let Cochran answer that. I have no idea what good higher education is. I know I like the kind of work that it involves, and I like introducing students and colleagues to that kind of work. That's it. I don't make any great claims for it. I don't believe in the nobility of the teaching profession. I don't believe in the sacred nature of education or anything of that. As I said in one of my books, it's just a job. But if it's just a job and it's your job, my message is do it, and don't do a whole set of other.
Nice work if you can get it.
That's right. That's another thing.
That was the title of a Stanley Fish.
Yeah, nice work. It is, and that raises an issue which was, I think, behind your question. Why should a society support this kind of activity? I haven't the slightest idea. I'm not a governor or a state legislature or a senator or something like that who has to make a decision as to whether or not higher education is worth supporting. I don't know. Why, for example, should there be support of the study of the kind of thing that I was talking about to my students back in 1964? Verse forms in the late 15th century, utilized by poets only perhaps 30 people have read since then. That is very, as I've said before, that's very odd. That's very odd. But for some of us, it's an impassioned inquiry. I remember once, not that I am older than dirt, but I wasn't around in 1934, although I was born in 1938. I wasn't around in 1934 when a dispute broke out in the Times Literary Supplement, an eminent cultural journal, about a line of poetry in Milton's poem, L'Allegro. And the line of poetry had said something about coming to the window. And the debate is about who or what is coming to the window in line 46.
This is crucial.
Of L'Allegro, exactly. Well, there were champions of every noun or noun phrase within 10 lines of that line. And people, eminent people, like Grierson and others, lined up on the pages of the TLS to have their say. And it went on for weeks and weeks and weeks. Finally, someone of the people said, perhaps we should stop this. It's going on long enough. We shouldn't worry this forever. And someone else said, it's a matter of Milton's poetic honor. So there's a bunch of crazy people like me who do this kind of thing. You want to support me? I'm very happy. If you want me to tell you why you should, I don't know.
Well, I'll just come back and give my position. That capacity to step back and perform the labor of understanding of something that you might find odious before, you know, step back. And I'll give you a story. An old friend of mine named Eugene Genovese, who was one of the great historians of the 20th century. In fact, he was a kid who came up in Brooklyn, poor kid, born in the 1930s, and he was a hardcore Stalinist. I asked him once, you know, Gene, you stayed a Stalinist way through the 50s, long after the show trials and everything, you know, and he said, Mark, when I was a kid, I wanted to hang every capitalist from a tree. I wanted to kill him. That's how hardcore he was, and he stayed with it. He goes to Brooklyn College. He's got some talent. He goes to graduate school at Columbia University in history. And he does pretty well in his classes, but he stumbles at the dissertation stage. He can't find a dissertation topic. And he goes to his teachers, and they were all liberal, but they played it straight. They had that disinterested perspective. They didn't politicize the classroom in that way. And he said, I'm having a hard trouble. And the dissertation director said, who became his dissertation director, said, pick the group that has the farthest outlook from your own that you possibly can. Don't pick something that you agree with, something that is just, you know, reactive to you. Make that your topic. The Stalinist, the communist, hardcore, no private property or anything. Who did he pick? The American slaveholders. And he became one of the great antebellum historians of the Senate. Won, you know, National Book Awards and everything for his study. But that was great advice. I mean, it turned out to be great advice. And that is the value of addressing that which is deeply opposed in a scholarly way, right? That's the academic approach.
You're trying to go deep on me again, Mark.
That's what I'm here for.
I had a dissertation problem, not as dramatic as Gene's, but I had a dissertation problem. I wanted to write a dissertation on the Romantic poet Byron, who was a very interesting character who had an incestuous relationship with his sister, who wrote one of the great comic epics in the history of literature. And I really liked Byron. And I'm going to write this dissertation on Byron. And it turned out that one of my colleagues, one of my graduate student colleagues, very smart scholar by the name of Rachel Mayer Brownstein, wanted to write on Byron and study with the same person. Only one of us could do it. And it turns out that she had a very, very interesting relationship with her brother. And she, not sexual, but she really wanted to write on Byron. And I said to myself, okay, I'll write on somebody else. So I went and looked around for somebody, and I found this absolutely unappetizing, angry old man writing at the end of the 16th century, John Skelton. And I wrote my dissertation on him. Why? Because I didn't want my colleague, student colleague, to be prevented from writing the dissertation she wanted to write. I didn't want to write any dissertation in that sense. I just wanted to get out of graduate school and make a few bucks. That's it. So I'm going to resist nobility again.
Why don't we open it up to questions for Professor Fish? Give a lot of time for discussion.
Who has the microphone?
I have one.
So if you have a question, we'll get the microphone to you. Before we start, I just want to say at some of these functions, normally there's a QR code and you scan it, you submit your questions, and then we look at it. And the reason they do that is because they're trying to say that it's a question and answer period, and we have a large audience. We would like them to be able to answer as many questions as possible. So if you're going beyond 30 seconds, you might have crossed over into debate over the question. But if you could keep your questions to about 30 seconds so we get as many as possible for our esteemed panel, that'd be great.
Okay, sure. If I could ask about academic freedom and the employer. I mean, you give the idea of the job. What if the employer is a state government, a public institution. You did this a little bit, but I want to give you a specific example, not a hypothetical, but in 2021, 3 law professors at the University of Florida were asked to give expert testimony on their field of expertise.
Yes, I remember that.
For the redistricting maps in Florida. Their administrators tried to stop them from presenting their evidence. And I just wonder, one of them spoke here at New College last year, and I wonder if that's an exception to your idea that there could be a time when you as a professor have an expertise that is relevant to the public discourse. Does that give you the freedom of speech that is a First Amendment thing, because now you're acting as a government actor?
Yes. Are you acting as a government actor? And I self-identified as a faculty member. That's the question that I would ask, because often university professors act as consultants in a variety of industries or areas. I have no quarrel with that. My only quarrel is that nobody's ever invited me to do it. But if I did do it, I would make it clear that I was, at the moment, acting as a consultant and not acting as an academic, and not trading on my academic credentials. And trading on one's academic credentials under the illusion that they give you a general permission to say or do anything you like is one of the things that I'm against. But again, it'd just be a question. You might remember the Harvard Professor James Wu. You remember Wu, who was a consultant to the Bush administration and consulted on matters of torture and presented his views on torture to the Bush administration, and his colleagues disliked his views on torture and therefore wished him to be removed from the faculty. But the president this was at actually University of California. The president of the University of California and the dean of the law school of which he was a member correctly said that what he did in that capacity had nothing necessarily to do with his obligations as a faculty member. And so long as he, in fact, fulfilled those obligations, there was no reason to sanction him.
And this goes even if you're using your academic expertise on your own time.
On your own time. One of my books that I know Mark likes was a book I wrote in 2008 called Save the World on Your Own Time. And that kind of gives you the real distillation of my general line of argument. I'm not saying don't go out and do things, but keep in mind what the academic job is and don't mix it up with other jobs.
Thank you. Does the responsibility of with your belief that everyone should stick to their own job, does the responsibility of the citizen override the contractual obligation of the professional? How does society improve and change with everybody falling in line and doing their job? Society itself is an academic endeavor and responsibility of the citizen to implement and impart what they believe to be best for their neighbors and themselves.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll give a kind of, I don't know, maybe two-part, I think, answer to that question. Part of the answer has already been given in the title of the book I just cited, Save the World on Your Own Time. If you are committed to causes which are, in your view, larger and more important than the university work that you do, then devote yourself to those causes after class and on weekends, and if you're lucky enough to have summer vacations during the summer. However, there may come a point, and that point came for many in the 60s, I recall, when you feel that what the world needs from you and other educated people is so urgent that you simply cannot put aside those urgencies and devote yourself to the classroom. At that point, I think the reasonable, and I hesitate to use the word moral, thing to do is resign. Or as I put it somewhere or other, the academy love it or leave it. There's no reason why you should love it if you don't love it, and if you love something else more, go do that something else. Just don't use the machinery of the academy to do that something else.
Thank you. I take what you had to say in your introductory remarks more as a statement of philosophical aspiration as to how the academy ought to be. But I think everyone here in attendance today, and I'm sure including yourselves on the stage, recognize that this is not the reality of how things actually are. So my question to you, Professor Fish, is how did things go so wrong?
Oh, well, I don't know. Look, those of us who are interested in academic freedom and write about it always begin with the 1915 document put forward by the then fledgling American Association of University Professors. It was a document written by John Dewey and Arthur Lovejoy, so it's quite... Oh, yeah? Well, I'll continue anyway. Now, in that document, called the 1915 Statement on Academic Freedom and Tenure, the authors make it clear that A, the point of education is to introduce students to materials with which they are previously unfamiliar, that this introduction, and of materials, and I'm practically quoting from the 1915 document, must be conducted in a scholarly spirit and not in the spirit of intemperate partisanship. So there are all kinds of statements in the 1915 document which indicate that my position has long been anticipated, as it has been by many. But then, at some point in the document, there's a warning. And that warning is, but you, that is you who are the stewards of the academy, both as administrators and as teachers, must take care to police your own shop. You must yourselves insist on a certain degree of fidelity to the academic enterprise as we have defined it. Because, and this is the warning, if you don't, others will step in and want to do it for you. Well, that was not only prophetic of what has happened in the last 20 to 30 years, but it actually reflected a history previous to 1915. There have always been efforts by external constituencies to take over the educational institution and make it over in someone's image. This happens all the time. In the I'm sorry to say this, Mark, you probably already know this, but in the 1915 statement, the enemy in one paragraph is identified as, and as I quote, barbarous trustees. barbarous trustees. But the enemy has also been at times identified as members of the church. In the early debates which led to the formation of the American Association of University Professors, debates at Stanford and Wisconsin about the firing of professors of economics because they held economic theories that some of the industries, the giants of industries, didn't like. Then later, it became, there were, of course, McCarthyite efforts to take over the academy. But since the 60s, some of the efforts to take over the academy have originated from inside the academy. From students who are, after all, to be forgiven. Student impulses are to be regarded as student impulses. And then from faculty members who wanted in some degree to be like their students. I remember when the free speech movement began in Berkeley, and some of my colleagues, as I said, abandoned their classroom responsibilities and devoted themselves to raising money for the students and for other things. And I saw one of my colleagues, someone I had gone to graduate school with, in an office handling 4 or 5 phones while he was raising money for the students and working against the administration. And I said to him, "Why are you doing this?" He said, "I've never had so much fun in my life." And I thought to myself, I wonder what he was doing when he was just an academic. I guess he wasn't having so some of my, it's always been a desire on the part of academics to be more than academics, to be wise people, to be good people, to be members of the army of virtue, of whatever it else. And I think this is in part what has brought us to this day. Another thing is, President Corcoran still in the room? Another thing is that, by and large, senior university administrators are a sorry lot. And one good evidence of this is that they listen to the advice from their from their Office of Academic Counsel on the campus. People who work in offices in universities who are lawyers have only one thing in mind: avoid trouble at all costs. They make a decision only on the basis of whether or not taking this course of action will offend someone, or taking this course of action offends someone else. What we need, are administrators who, A, know what their job is. No, they're not in the free speech business, they're not in the democracy business, they're in the education business, and don't let anyone make them swerve from that job. But I don't see that.
Real quick, do you blame the general counsels at Harvard, Penn for the disastrous congressional testimony?
Blame is, I don't know whether I blame them in some formal sense, but I'll call them stupid in some informal sense. First of all, it was the president of Columbia University who had the right idea when he was invited to participate. I think it was a he, I'm not sure. Said something like, "Sorry, I have a dentist appointment." That was the right idea. You're going to walk into a congressional hearing by a whole bunch of congressmen, backbench congressmen, who are looking for a moment of publicity and looking for someone to gobble up in front of the camera. And you're going to walk in there and expose yourself? How stupid. They should have been just told, don't go. I know of no law that requires academic administrators to appear before congressional committees. So that was just total stupidity. And the people who lost their jobs deserve to lose their jobs because they weren't doing their jobs.
Hi. Gender studies has existed in some form in academia for 54 years.
Yeah.
There was a movement to abolish it on our campus. The justification by the trustee who made the motion was that taxpayers have spoken and lawmakers have an obligation to end or reform programs that don't align with taxpayer wishes. But lawmakers change frequently. So I'm just curious what your stance is.
Oh, I think that's totally wrong. That's totally wrong. Gender studies is like critical race studies, or Holocaust denial studies, or alt-right studies, or studies of this very interesting phenomenon that I mentioned briefly, Christian nationalism, which has many historical antecedents and is a rich field of investigation. Any of these should be studied. Now, as far as saying, well, this public has spoken, my answer to that is, what has the public to do with it? What does the public know? Public doesn't know, and I won't use any bad words, the public doesn't know anything. When I was a dean at the college, University of Illinois, Chicago College of Arts and Sciences, I went to talk to the legislators because, as usual, our budget was being cut, and I wanted them to perhaps put some money back into it. And so I went and talked to them, and I asked, like most state legislators, they were part-time. They had real jobs most of the time. They were doctors, they were captains of industry or shop owners or so forth. And I said to them this, the legislators, I said, look, suppose I went into your shop or your doctor's or your clinical office for about 45 minutes and then came out and then told you how to run your shop. And you would, of course, say, that's ridiculous. Well, nevertheless, you guys, you're ridiculous because you, without any knowledge whatsoever of the way in which academic work flows, think that you're going to be able to and should be able to determine its features. And then I said, here's my offer to you. You come and sit at my feet in my classroom for 15 weeks and don't say a word. And then maybe I'll let you say something. By the way, they loved it, A, but B, I didn't get any money.
Yes, hello, Professor Fish. Your opening remarks echo with an essay that's one of my favorites by Max Weber, Science as a Vocation.
Science as a Vocation, right.
And, an essay that really focuses on the moral obligation of the scholar who really wants to pursue scholarly work as a vocation. But there's a piece that you don't really talk about, and that you make it sound as if the choice of things to study is almost random. Oh, you were going to do Byron, but someone else had a prior claim to it, so you picked randomly a poet that no one else knew about. And I think that might be a little bit of misrepresentation of the way academic work actually happens. And the piece I'm referring to is Weber's discussion of the importance of value relevance. How we choose our questions, how we frame our questions, and that value relevance is not just personal, but he describes it methodologically as being cultural and connecting to things that are, in fact, outside the job that we do in the classroom. Even though we try to maintain that line that you're describing, but that role in the ivory tower is not quite as securely closed off as we sometimes might wish it were.
Closed off. What do you mean? I'm sorry. What do you mean by closed off?
Well, we are answerable sometimes, and we have to answer to.
I'd have to have. I hope you could be more specific. How, in what ways are we answerable? Maybe you could give an example.
Well, so what topics do we study? What the relevance of the topics that we study. I mean, it has to do most directly with what's going to put backsides in the seats in classrooms. Are students going to be interested? Yeah. It has to do with whether or not what the work we're doing is relevant in the world. And it seems as if you don't believe that there's any obligation for an academic to think about things that are important to people outside of academia.
While doing the work of the academic, yes, I do think that for me, relevant in the world is not a requirement. It's something that, in fact, might be produced by academic work. You might remember that at one point I talked about the practice long followed of picking on something or noting something thought by everyone to be totally inconsequential, and then interrogating it with an academic lens and bringing to it the machinery of academic analysis. So lo and behold, it becomes a topic that people begin to pay attention to. So the academy can, in fact, produce its own forms of relevance. But I do not, I am sure there are people who say to themselves, I'm going to teach X or Y because the world needs to hear about it. I suppose I honor them, but actually I am befuddled by them. I'm going to teach things because they pique my academic interest. That's it. They pique my academic interest. Whether or not they carry anywhere else outside the classroom, I haven't the slightest idea. When you're a teacher, there are two things that you can possibly do, and they're very hard things to do. One is to introduce your students to bodies of material with which they've been hitherto relatively unfamiliar. And the second thing that you can do is introduce them to techniques of analysis, interpretive techniques, statistical techniques, laboratory techniques that will allow them to do research on these topics once your class is over. That's a huge task. What you don't, and if you can accomplish it, that's all you can accomplish. What you don't want to do, hang your academic hat on, is what happens to students after the 14th or 15th week and they exit from your class. I haven't the slightest idea of what's going to happen to my students, but I do know that it would be wrong for me to teach in a way designed to make my students into certain kinds of persons, except persons who knew something about the material, the material in the course. I've had the experience, as has many older academics, of having someone come up to me in an airport and say, "Oh, Professor Fish, I was your student in XY course, in 1540 or whatever the year was. And I remember so vividly when you said X about Y, and I have used that to produce my wonderful career in Z." And I'm thinking to myself, I never would have said X. I believed exactly the worst, and I certainly wouldn't want to be responsible for anyone getting into the profession that this person is now in. But you should not feel ashamed because students who are in your classes turned out in ways that you think either disreputable or unworthy, but you should also not feel pride that some students in your classes have turned into exemplary human beings doing genuine service in the world. That is all, to use one of my favorite words, that's contingent. That's contingent. What happens to your students after they leave your classroom is contingent. What happens while they're in your classroom with respect to whether or not they get to know the material is not contingent. And that's what you should focus on.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Fish, for all.
I can't see where the...
I'm here, right here.
Oh.
One of the things that I wanted to ask, one of the principles of academic freedom that seems to be pretty much accepted theoretically across the board, but pretty much ignored, is what came out of University of Chicago around 1960 is the so-called
Calvin report. Yeah,
right. Which, I mean, in a very simplistic way, it says that basically universities are not supposed to have opinions about social and political matters.
Right.
Which, as you know, has been abused and ignored across the political spectrum. It's not really exclusive to one side. How do you suggest a young faculty should push against an administration that doesn't acknowledge that principle, that to do the academic task
that's very difficult, because in my view of the way things should be, it's administrations and administrators who should insist that the academic task be performed in an academic manner, there should be mechanisms. Unfortunately, there are not. When I was a dean, it was only in the last, I think, semester of my deanship that I discovered something from my chief accountant, which, had I known it, would have altered the course of my deanship from the beginning. He told me that I had the right to dock people's salaries. I thought, God, I had the right to dock people's salaries, because there are all kinds of bad actors who turn up you know, not the majority, but there's always bad actors who turn up. And what can you do to them? You rebuke them, and so forth. But then I had this wonderful tool. I could take their salaries away, which I proceeded to do. But I only had a short time. To do it. So, yeah, it's hard when if you're a young faculty member and you're in a situation in which the kind of what I've called alien pressures are not only being exerted but welcomed by our administration. That would be indeed very, very difficult. But there are people who speak out. My favorite statement, which I've made now so often that I think that I make the mistake of thinking that everyone in the world knows it, but I'll take that risk. It was in 2002, when the invasion of Iraq was being discussed, but had not yet occurred. Student protests against the impending invasion of Iraq erupted all over the country. And one of the schools where there was a large protest was the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and students came and surrounded the provost building and with signs and placards. And he came out to talk to them, and he said only one thing, but it was a sentence of genius. He said, "The University of Wisconsin does not have a foreign policy." I mean, think about that. That is so smart. The University of Wisconsin, and I would then add, neither does it have a monetary policy or an agricultural policy or a pharmacological policy or any of those other policies. It has or should have educational policies. If people could just, now I've seen recently, because of what happened, I mean, the spectacle of the former presidents of University of Pennsylvania, my alma mater, and Harvard, the spectacle of their being publicly humiliated and then deprived of their positions has led a lot of people defensively to return to the principles of the Calvin Report. And maybe there will be more of them.
Dr. Fish and Dr. Bauerlein, we have time for 4 more questions. Alexandra is going to take the first one, and then I have a couple more over here. And then in the end, Dr. Fish and Dr. Bauerlein, you can close and people can have the opportunity to speak with you afterwards.
Thank you.
This may or may not be relevant, but I'd like to ask this question. Should someone take on debt to take your course?
I'm sorry?
Should someone take on debt to take your course?
Take on debt? I thought you first said death. Should someone be dead? No. I hope my courses are good and useful for my students. But I don't believe that people who happen not to have taken my courses are therefore deprived of something essential to their being. So no, my answer to that would be no.
Over here.
Professor, first of all, I want to say that I loved going to school in the 60s when professors would give me their opinions, and it was exactly what I wanted to hear. And I mean no disrespect, but I think if I were to attend your class, I might be disappointed.
I don't think so.
Well, let me tell you why. The courses that you mentioned, I'm always a little bit out there, but it's okay. The courses that you mentioned that are quite all right to teach, critical race theory.
Yeah, I teach it myself.
Issues around anti-Semitism, issues around trans and pronouns, etc. If I were in your class and you were teaching those issues, I would want desperately to know your opinion, because I respect you. I would want to know your opinion. What is wrong, in your opinion, with anti-Semitism? What might be wrong with critical race theory? What might be wrong with all the anti-gay stuff? And if you were free to tell me that, I would feel cheated.
All right, that's a good question. First of all, you're quite correct. If I do teach those materials, and partly because 3 years ago now, I think, along with in company of 3 other colleagues, I published a case book in law. Some of you are familiar with legal case books. They're about the size of this building. So we produced, 4 of us produced one on jurisprudence, that is the philosophy of law, which contains 13 chapters. I am responsible for 4 of them, and one of the 4 that I'm responsible for is the chapter on LGBTQ law, which I've subsequently then, of course, taught that chapter. There's also a chapter on critical race theory in this anthology, which was edited by one of the founders of critical race theory, Richard Delgado. And in all of these chapters, what you have are texts, discussions of texts, descriptions of the objectives of the agenda, arguments pro and con, and so forth. That's a lot to teach, and but it can be taught effectively. I'm not sure what is added to that if your instructor becomes a cheerleader for something or other, or for one position or another. So that, as I said earlier in my introductory remarks, to my mind, the ideal is to have your students know nothing about your opinions except your opinions on the material. And there's a version of what you say, and I'm not attributing it to you. There are some professors who believe I'm going to tell my students what my views are ahead of time, so that they will be, in effect, insulated against them. That is a real cheat. That's in fact, when you do that, you don't insulate your students, you instruct your students as to what they should or should not say. The best thing to do is to present the materials. And the reason that I don't think necessarily that you would be disappointed in my class, although there are certainly students that I've had over the years who have been disappointed in my class, but the reason that I don't think you necessarily would be disappointed, because the materials that most of us teach in the humanities, social science, and physical sciences are rich and complicated and complex, and you become aware of matters and ways of thinking about matters that were unavailable to you before. I think I'm giving machinery to Mark here by saying that, and that's what you will enjoy. I can't see why someone should enjoy knowing what his or her professor thinks about some disputed issues. That's a matter, perhaps, of biographical concern, but not a matter which I think should find its way directly into our classroom.
Dr. Fish, you wrote an op-ed in the New York Times on January 6, 2008 about the humanities.
Guilty.
And I quote, "To the question of what use are the humanities, the only honest answer is none whatsoever."
Yeah, I did say
an activity that cannot be justified is an activity that refuses to regard itself as instrumental to some larger good. The humanities are their own good. How does this argument negotiate the value of the humanities within the public sphere if the good stops within the discipline itself?
The answer is that it doesn't. That is, my argument and my way of describing the academy, my answer to a question, a very good question that was asked earlier about the general relevance of what we teach and the degree to which we should concern ourselves with the general relevance. My answer to those questions does not provide the basis for presenting a case for the humanities to various constituencies, like donors, politicians, legislatures, and so forth and so on. And that's why I always advise educational institutions to hire political agencies to do that work for them. That is, rather than trying to do it yourself, just hire someone who's going to sell you to the relevant constituencies. And I think that's the wiser and indeed perhaps the more honest course than trying to sell yourself because I don't think there are any terms. I don't know of any terms. What would happen to the world if all the commentary on Milton or George Herbert or Emily Dickinson or Ernest Hemingway whoever were to disappear tomorrow? Some people would lose their jobs. And since some of them would be friends of mine, I would be unhappy. But I would be hard-pressed to argue that the world was considerably poorer because of the disappearance of Milton studies or Emily Dickinson studies or Shakespeare studies. This is a specialist kind of work. It's not a priesthood. It's not a theology. It's not a do-good service. It's just a job.
Professor Fish, you began our conversation by talking about the importance of freedom for the academic task, and then for the last hour or so, the academic task has been defined as teaching and research. A large part of the academic task in my day-to-day life is shared governance, and in shared governance, particularly curricular discussions. Is there any obligation for an administration to allow for freedom of speech and opinion? Should faculty who disagree with administration ideas about curriculum be censored, or is that totally at the discretion of the administration, or is there a certain kind of academic freedom that allows for the shared governance that depends on the specialized knowledge of the faculty?
Okay. Shared governance is a possible form of educational organization. It is not a moral imperative. That is, there are schools, perhaps schools of the size of this one, where the population is small and the cast of characters know each other in an intimate way, and the number of students is knowable. In those kinds of contexts, I can see a place for shared governance. It's an organizational option. It's not a mark of virtue to have shared governance. And anyone who proposed shared governance for something like the University of Michigan would be out of his or her mind. It would never work. So I don't think that faculty members have a perfect right to agitate for higher salaries, lower course assignments, better and larger offices, an improved library, etc. All of those things are directly related to the academic task. But suppose your university or college, to take a random example, decides to move into athletics in a big way. And you decide, you yourself believe that, well, that hasn't got anything to do with the academic task. We shouldn't have that. The answer to that is you're not the president. You're someone who's sitting in a classroom teaching medieval metrics. Just do it. Thank you all very much.